the offspring of stupidity and ignorance, others the inevitable corollaries of false principles, and still others the result of more or less base passions, has induced the decline of labor, an evil which, instead of being remedied by prudence, mature reflection and recognition of the mistakes made, through deplorable policy, through regret, table blindness and obstinacy, has gone from bad to worse, until it has reached the condition in which we now see it. First came the wars, the internal disorders which the new change of affairs naturally brought with it. It was necessary to subject the people either by cajolery or force. There were fights, there was slaughter, those who had submitted peacefully seemed to repent of it, insurrections were suspected, and some occurred, naturally there were executions, and many capable laborers perished.
Add to these chaotic conditions the invention of limahong and the ongoing war into which the Filipino of the Philippines were dragged in order to preserve Spain's honor, to spread her flag's sway in Borneo, in the Moluccas, and Indochina.
Add to this condition of disorder the invasion of limahong, add the continual wars into which the inhabitants of the Philippines were plunged to maintain the honor of Spain, to extend the sway of her flag in Borneo, in the Moluccas and in Indochina, to repel the Dutch foe, costly wars, fruitless expeditions, in which each time thousands and thousands of native archers and rowers were recorded to have embarked, but whether they returned to their homes was never stated. Like the tribute that once upon a time Greece sent to the Minotaur of Crete, the Philippine youth embarked for the expedition, saying goodbye to their country forever. On their horizon were the stormy sea, the interminable wars, the rash expeditions.
Next slide, please. Though formerly there were many people in this town of the Mangas, in the course time there has been a great diminution, because the natives are the best sailors, says Gaspar de San Agustin.
Wherefore, Gaspar de San Agustin says, although anciently there were in this town of Tumangas many people, in the course of time they have very greatly diminished, because the natives are the best sailors and most skillful rowers on the whole coast, and so the governors in the port of Iloilo take most of the people from this town for the ships that they send abroad. When the Spaniards reached this island, Panay, it is said that there were on it more than 50,000 families, but these diminished greatly, and at present they may amount to some 14,000 tributaries. From 50,000 families to 14,000 tributaries in little over half a century. We would never get through, had we to quote all the evidence of the authors regarding the frightful diminution of the inhabitants of the Philippines in the first years after the discovery.
Philippines in the first year after discovery, during the time of the first bishop, Philip II, 10 years after Legazpi, said they had been reduced to less than 2/3.
In the time of their first bishop, that is, 10 years after Legazpi, Philip II said that they had been reduced to less than 2/3. Add to these fatal expeditions that wasted all the moral and material energies of the country, the frightful inroads of the terrible pirates from the south, instigated and encouraged by the government, first in order to get complaint and afterwards disarm the islands subjected to it, inroads that reached the very shores of Manila, even Malate itself, and during which were seen to set out for captivity and slavery, in the baleful glow of burning villages, strings of wretches who had been unable to defend themselves, leaving behind them the ashes of their homes and the corpses of their parents and children. Morga, who recounts the first piratical invasion, says, "The boldness of these people of Mindanao did great damage to the Visayan Islands, as much by what they did in them as by the fear and fright which the native acquired, because the latter were in the power of the Spaniards, who held them subject and tributary and unarmed, in such manner that they did not protect them from their enemies or leave them means with which to defend themselves, as they did when there were no Spaniards in the country." These piratical attacks continually reduced the number of the inhabitants of the Philippines, since the independent Malays were especially notorious for their atrocities and murders. Sometimes because they believed that to preserve their independence it was necessary to weaken the Spaniard by reducing the number of his subjects, sometimes because a greater hatred and a deeper resentment inspired them against the Christian Filipinos who, being of their own race, served the stranger in order to deprive them of their precious liberty. These expeditions lasted about 3 centuries, being repeated 5 and 10 times a year, and each expedition cost the islands over 800 prisoners. With the invasions of the pirates from Sulu and Mindanao, says Padre Gaspar de San Agustin, the island of Bantayan, near Cebu, has been greatly reduced, because they easily captured the people there, since the latter had no place to fortify themselves and were far from help from Cebu. The hostile Sulu did great damage in this island in 1608, leaving it almost depopulated. These rough attacks, coming from without, produced a counter-effect in the interior, which, carrying out medical comparisons, was like a purge or diet in an individual who has just lost a great deal of blood. In order to make headway against so many calamities, to secure their sovereignty and take the offensive in these disastrous contests, to isolate the warlike Zulus from their neighbors in the south, to care for the needs of the Empire of the Indies, for one of the reasons why the Philippines were kept, as contemporary documents prove, was their strategic position between New Spain and the Indies, to wrest from the Dutch their growing colonies of the Moluccas and get rid of some troublesome neighbors, to maintain, in short, the trade of China with New Spain. It was necessary to construct new and large ships which, as we have seen, costly as they were to the country for their equipment and the rowers they required, were not less so because of the manner in which they were constructed. Fernando de los Rios Coronel, who fought in these wars and later turned priest, speaking of these king's ships, said, as they were so large, the timber needed was scarcely to be found in the forests of the Philippines, and thus it was necessary to seek it with great difficulty in the most remote of them, where, once found, in order to haul and convey it to the shipyard the towns of the surrounding country had to be depopulated of natives, who get it out with immense labor, damage, and cost to them. The natives furnished the masts for a galleon, according to the assertion of the Franciscans, and I heard the governor of the province where they were cut, which is Lacuna de Bay, say that to haul them 7 leagues over very broken mountains 6,000 natives were engaged 3 months, without furnishing them food, which the wretched native had to seek for himself. And Gaspar de San Agustin says, in those times, 1690, Bacolor has not the people that it had in the past, because of the uprising in that province when Don Sabiniano Manrique de Lava was governor of these islands, and because of the continual labor of cutting timber for His Majesty's shipyards, which hinders them from cultivating the very fertile plain they have. If this is not sufficient to explain the depopulation of the islands and the abandonment of industry, agriculture and commerce, then add the natives who were executed, those who left their wives and children and fled in disgust to the mountains, those who were sold into slavery to pay the taxes levied upon them, as Fernando de los Rios Coronel says. Add to all this what Philip II said in reprimanding Bishop Salazar about natives sold by some encomenderos to others, those flogged to death, the women who are crushed to death by their heavy burdens, those who sleep in the fields and there bear and nurse their children and die bitten by poisonous vermin, the many who are executed and left to die of hunger and those who eat poisonous herbs, and the mothers who kill their children in bearing them, and you will understand how in less than 30 years the population of the Philippines was reduced 1/3. We are not saying this, it was said by Gaspar de San Agustin, the preeminently anti-Filipino Augustinian, and he confirms it throughout the rest of his work by speaking every moment of the state of neglect in which lay the farms and fields once so flourishing and so well cultivated, The town's thin that had formerly been inhabited by many leading families. How is it strange, then, that discouragement may have been infused into the spirit of the inhabitants of the Philippines, when in the midst of so many calamities they did not know whether they would see sprout the seed they were planting, whether their field was going to be their grave or their crop would go to feed their executioner? What is there strange in it, when we see the pious but impotent friars of that time trying to free their poor parishioners from the tyranny of the encomenderos by advising them to stop work in the mines, to abandon their commerce, to break up their looms, pointing out to them heaven for their whole hope, preparing them for death as their only consolation? Man works for an object. Remove the object and you reduce him to inaction. The most active man in the world will fold his arms from the instant he understands that it is madness to bestir himself, that this work will be the cause of his trouble, that for him it will be the cause of vexations at home and of the pirate's greed abroad. It seems that these thoughts have never entered the minds of those who cry out against the indolence of the Filipinos.
Next slide, please. Even if a Filipino is not a man like the rest, he has zeal for essential as the movement.
Even were the Filipino not a man like the rest, even were we to suppose that zeal in him for work was as essential as the movement of a wheel caught in the gearing of others in motion, even were we to deny him foresight and the judgment that the past and the present form, there would still be left us another reason to explain the attack of the evil. The abandonment of the fields by their cultivators, whom the wars and piratical attacks dragged from their homes, was sufficient to reduce to nothing the hard labor of so many generations. In the Philippines, abandon for a year the land most beautifully tended and you will see how you will have to begin all over again. The rain will wipe out the furrows, the floods will drown the seeds, plants and bushes will grow up everywhere, and on seeing so much useless labor the hand will drop the hoe, the laborer will desert his plow. Isn't there left the fine life of the pirate?
Thus understood the sad discouragement found in the friar writers of the 17th century of provinces and towns depopulated, leading to the extinction of families.
Thus is understood that sad discouragement which we find in the friar writers of the 17th century, speaking of once very fertile plains submerged, of provinces and towns depopulated, of products that have disappeared from trade, of leading families exterminated. These pages resemble a sad and monotonous scene in the night after a lively day. Of Cagayan Padre, San Agustin speaks with mournful brevity, a great deal of cotton, of which they made good cloth that the Chinese and Japanese every year bought and carried away. In the historian's time, the industry and the trade had come to an end. It seems that these are causes more thorn sufficient to breed indolence even in the midst of beehive. Thus is explained why, after 32 years of the system, the circumspect and prudent Morga said that the natives have forgotten much about farming, raising poultry, stock and cotton, and weaving cloth, as they used to do in their paganism and for a long time after the country had been conquered.
Still they struggle on for a long time against indolence. Indeed, but their enemies were so many that at last they gave up. Next slide, please. His complete analysis of the Filipino in relation to his captors, the Spaniards, puts forward that the indolence of the Filipino at that time of his writing was not a sudden phenomenon. Rather, it was a build-up due to the despair they felt of having their freedom taken away. Next slide, please. In other words, the Filipinos' indolence is merely a result of their resignedness. Rizal captured this by giving us an image of a hard-working man who at the end of the day has his goods taken away from him by his captors. Next slide, please. Cycle goes on. The man finds no purpose in having to work hard if the fruits of his labor are enjoyed by another, while he is left with nothing but barren land. Of course, The soil in the Philippines is great for cultivating plants, henceforth, why many natives